So now, with no more further ado, let me introduce our mayor, John Engen. What is this, the 50th mayor? And very, very active and supportive of activities at St. Patrick's Hospital and very active in our community. So let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. I have microphone technology that does not require me to be near a microphone, which is kind of nice. And frankly, I want this all the time in my life, but I won't do that to you. I have to say that last exercise, Kathleen, was fantastic for non-Norwegians. For Norwegians, however, extraordinarily uncomfortable. So thank you for that. Amy was kind enough to share much insight as my partner in that exercise, and I was, well, I love bacon, as it turns out. So, fantastic. It's a pleasure to see this lovely panel here, folks. Occasionally in my line of work, we spend time thinking about the things that divide us, and sometimes we spend more of our time thinking about that which divides us and talking about that which divides us than we do talking about that which unites us. But we have a unique role in this community every day. Given the variety of opinions, we can always find something to agree on, and once in a while we can convince someone that each other's point of view may have merit beyond what we might have imagined. So these folks are all about crossing divides, and they've either crossed one on their own, they've climbed a hill and gotten to the other side and they've seen the beautiful valley, or they lead folks up the mountain and share that view with them, and we're lucky to have all of them. You have introductions of all these folks in your program, so I won't belabor that. I will tell you, however, that each one brings an interesting perspective to our conversation today. We'll start with, I'll introduce everyone, and we'll begin the speechifying, as it were. Bill Ritchie is a retired mining vice president. Zach Brown is the president of the Associated Students of the University of Montana, and a student there as well. Kathleen Kennedy is a science teacher all the way at Big Sky High School. Jan Holm is co-founder of MELT, which I thought was a cheese-based organization at one time, but it's not. It's actually Montana Elders for a Livable Tomorrow. And the venerable Beth Schenk, a good egg all around, is a nurse and sustainability coordinator here at St. Patrick Hospital. And in preparation for this panel today, the panelists were asked to briefly describe how they've gotten themselves or others across a divide, big or small, one way or another. And Bill, we can start with you, please.
Sure, can you? Okay, I can hear it. When I was asked to come and speak at Crossing the Divide and turning the tide, it seemed like a huge, huge task. Turning the tide is kind of a gigantic task. And, you know, it's kind of like crossing the Rubicon or, you know, crossing the river Styx, it sounds like. But I was asked, I assume, because I'm the token coal miner who can be pummeled by everyone in the audience if you want to. But I think they were looking for my epiphany about how I became a human being after being a coal miner. Actually, it wasn't an epiphany. In the days that we were mining coal, we thought we were doing royally great work. We mined low sulfur Montana coal and fought the evildoers in the east with their high sulfur polluting acid rain creating coal. Those were the enemies. We fought them in Congress, we fought them every day, and thought we were really doing great work. How I crossed the divide, I would say, on coal is I I've been very pleased with the stuff we've heard today. It's been outstanding, and a lot of the stuff that Kevin Dorr talked about was stuff I was going to talk about, but I won't cover it too much because he knows it a lot better than I do. But I think most of us get to where we are just gradually. I don't think we have that many aha moments in our world and in our lives that change significant things for us. My worldview basically was developed, and I can't take credit for it. It's the product of my parents, my teachers, and people that as I passed on through life. But I think I see the world with people with two basic views. One are those that look externally, and the others are those that look internally. Kind of like belly buttons, there's inners and outers, or innies and outers. I don't know that correlates with their beliefs, but anyway, I think it's a thing that really helped me, because in preparing for this, I was looking at how do you define belief and opinion and this kind of thing, and was distressed but not surprised to find most of it was not evidence or fact-based. A belief is something you just kind of hold, or you can. It's until I got to the third definition of it that it said based on evidence, an examination of evidence. Maybe talking in a faith-based atmosphere such as this, it's the wrong thing to say, but I believe that faith and belief have to examine evidence as it sees it. And you may need to make changes rather than to define the evidence so that it fits your beliefs. So as I got through there, I learned more and more about the coal business after I left, and more about coal as we learned, and more about climate change and greenhouse gases and the problems. Being as I was raised to realize I was just one little piece of pond scum in the whole world, I thought that's not a good thing. It's harmful to the rest of the world. There are those that are still in the industry or in everyday life that have an internal view where everything kind of comes close to them. And they're motivated differently. They're not wrong. They're just motivated differently. Some of the best people I've ever worked with were in the coal industry. And their worldview really may relate to jobs, feeding their families. There's a lot of things, and it's hard to argue that point, to successfully say to someone who is feeding their family, or the people now that will drive all the way to the Bakken and live in that holy hell that's over there to try to improve their family's well-being, to tell them they're doing something wrong. So I think as we approach these issues, we have to listen to some of the things that we're listen to today about talking to the elephant. I thought, maybe an elephant was just kind of a coincidence as the symbol of the creature that was running amok, but I think it's something that we really do have to understand as we try to go through these issues and deal with them. Last night was a very good night, and I was very pleased with some of the speakers, but I really don't think these are issues that are handled by polite conversation and getting along with a friend who may have a different opinion. I think this is almost on a marketing scale. If we are going to have actions that are going to cure things, we have to change opinion makers' minds. We have to be able to get legislation and changes that really have impact. And sometimes talking politely to each other isn't the answer. Unfortunately, as was pointed out today, education often isn't the answer either, because we are belief-driven and we are defensive of our beliefs. One study, and then I'll probably finish up because most of what I was going to say was covered earlier. But one study I just recently read about was they took a group of Republicans and a group of Democrats, and they presented two educational plans to them. And I can go into it. One involved teacher pay and ability to fire teachers easier, and another one was on, teaching the basics and this type of thing. Well, they told the first group, it was half Republicans and half Democrats, that say Plan A was a Republican plan, and Plan B was a Democratic plan. And not surprisingly, I know all you can see this coming, 75% of the Republicans liked the Republican plan, very strongly. 75% of the Democrats liked the plan. They then went to the control groups and switched the definition of whose plan was which. And not surprisingly, 75% of the Republicans liked the Republican plan, and 75% of the Democrats liked the Democrat plan. It's very difficult then to think we can educate our way out of this situation. We have to appeal to hopes, hearts, minds, beliefs, fears, the things that really determine how we make up our minds. We've got to enlist educators and leaders because they are people that people look up to, and politicians, such as the mayor. They have influence far beyond just the words that they speak. And we've got to try to get people to pay attention to the real issues, which are the suffering that is caused by pollution and this type of thing. One other piece with it, as we deal with those that don't want to accept or deny, that I thought was very well pointed out today, is we have to look at what motivates. Urian Fisher did one of, I think, the greatest books on negotiation and getting to the conclusions you need to. And I view this more as a negotiation than a discussion. It does no good, like I said, if I sat down with my buddy who wanted to deny it, and we talked very politely and late into the night. I mean, I had one. It was an oil man from Calgary. And we talked till 3 in the morning. Had a great time. Drank lots of beer. It was fabulous. Expressed our opinions, and then separated the next day right back to the exact same opinions we'd had before. So that's not as productive as really negotiating with people and understanding what will make them take action. And part of it is fear. When you look at those who want to deny climate change, they still love their children, just like we do. They care about their children. Those are issues that will make them take action, is the protection of their tribe, their children, the ones they care closely about. Care about economic security. Some of the stuff that was talked about is we can't just say, stop coal tomorrow. That's ridiculous. It just won't happen. But we can offer alternatives and transitions that get us out of that situation and still provide for jobs and equality and things that will help take care of them. So I think that's really where our issues come from, is we have to understand, as Urian Fisher said, it's the interests and not the positions that they take when we do a negotiation. That's where I started to get to. We have to understand their interests and appeal to their interests. Because this is a democracy, we're not going to get everything we want in all of these issues. And so we have to compromise, everyone does, but we have to make sure that compromise leads to the things that we wanted to. And with that, I'll hush up and let.
Thank you, Bill. And without objection, we'll just march down the path. Jan?
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you today. A meeting like this would not have happened 10 years ago, and that's an exciting change. I'm going to talk to you about our group, Montana Elders for a Livable Tomorrow, and how we came together. I want to share what we learned in the process. MELT formed when we crossed a divide, and it came straight out of the blue. A bunch of us were in a lifelong learning class taught by Dr. George Seilstad on sustainability. On the third lecture, he talked about the atmosphere, and a lot of people were hearing about climate change for the first time. And what we heard was that the science is conclusive, the Earth is in a lot of hurt, and the future will suffer the most. When the lecture was over, we just sat there. And somebody said, well, what are we going to do about it? And somebody else said, is there a place we can go to talk? And Dr. Seilstad found a place for us, and we've been meeting ever since. That was 2.5 years ago. That day we crossed a divide. We went from inaction to taking action. We went from being alone to being together. So people who wouldn't have known each other, there are now over 20 of us, pooled our various resources, our contacts, our experience, and our skills. We are educators, government workers, medical professionals, biologists, energy company employees, geologists, commercial fishermen, a legislature, and most of those with the word former in front of them. We have two things in common. One of them is our age and the sense that time is short, both for us and for us as a world, to respond to the climate situation we face. And the second one is that we want to leave a better world to future generations. It is the young and the unborn who will suffer the most if we don't get off the dime. I read somewhere that the continuum of how this climate change thing is going to develop is something like mediation, adaptation, and suffering. And the more we do in the realm of mediation, the less adaptation and the less suffering. The longer we wait in the front, the more suffering there will be in the end. Our focus as a group is clean air, sustainability, and climate change, and in Montana that means coal. We don't always agree on everything. We have interesting discussions, and we listen to each other. We've given each other a voice, and there's nothing passive about us. Our third meeting was getting together for a meal following what Ray Risho, who used to own and cook at Perugia's, told us about something called gastrodiplomacy. And he told us a story about Reagan and Gorbachev getting together in 1986 to negotiate a nuclear arms treaty. And after a really good meal and maybe a glass or two of wine, the two of them decided to take a walk. And as they walked, they talked about their families, and eventually they got around to what they were there to discuss. And they started saying, well, why can't we just do this thing? Well, their handler stepped in and said, oh, you can't do that. It has to go through blah, 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 all that stuff. But a year later, in 1987, they signed a treaty. I thought I had a nuclear arms treaty. It was. Never mind. And George Shultz, who was Secretary of State at that time, wrote in his book that the beginnings of that treaty signature came about from that walk that those two men took after a good meal. So maybe if you want to talk to someone who disagrees with you, you might want to eat with them first. So with MELT, we celebrate. We have dinners together 2 or 3 times a year. And by eating and meeting and working together, we've become friends. And one thing that happens a lot in our age group is that people find themselves isolated and kind of dropping out of the world scene. And we certainly don't have that feeling. We don't work alone, either in a personal sense or in a group sense. We've joined with the Sierra Club. Most of the things we've done with other groups, like the Sierra Club, Northern Plains Resource Council, Blue Skies, and UMCAN at the university, the American Lung Association, Transition Town, Climate Solutions, MEIC. They call us, and we do what we can when we can. We write letters, we go to events, we create events, we go to Helena and speak to the legislature. A bunch of us drove to Spokane for the scoping hearings on the coal exports. And we initiate events. In May, we hope to make a movie showing the Tongue River and Otter Creek area, going from there along the rail line west, telling the story. And we have contacts that we've been given by talking to people in these various organizations. So here's what we've learned. We've learned the importance of breaking the ice, of having someone who's willing to say, what can we do about it, and let's talk. We've learned about speaking out. We've learned about joining forces, working with other groups. Don't pass up an opportunity, connect. This is not the time for turf wars. Working together makes us stronger. Appreciate everyone's efforts and let them know about it, and use your time wisely. So this is what we've learned. I hope something in what I've said is useful, and for us it has made a difference.
Thank you, Jan, very much. Kathleen.
Well, I wish that this conference had taken place maybe 6 years ago, because if it had, if I had received the kinds of insights into the psyche of people's belief systems, or had some discussion about how we talk about difficult issues, I wouldn't have been asked to be on this panel. Because I probably have to talk first about the failure to cross the divide as kind of the formative experience for me. So if you don't know this already, I am the woman who showed her students the story of stuff. Thank you. I'm one of, probably thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of teachers who have done that same act. But I showed it because I had been teaching about things for years and to no effect. I hadn't seen any sort of change. I didn't feel like I was having an impact. And I thought, well, I want to have a discussion. I want to do something that's going to provoke my students in a positive way. I mean, let me get under their skin so that then they're inspired to share and talk about this. And unfortunately, through whatever strange alignment of the stars, I don't know what, but it became a very different, it became cast in a very different light than was my intent, or than what happened in my classroom. And it was kind of taken and spun into this very strange conspiracy. And I was trying to get Obama elected, and I don't even know. I can't even begin to understand what the motivation was, but believe me, I've tried. I mean, it became almost like an obsession to me to try to understand what had happened. But there were some things that came out in that experience that I think have helped me in subsequent years, and have helped me to recover from that experience, because believe me, it was very painful for me, because I was being told that I was motivated by something that was in no way what my intention was. And for those of us that were talking about love last night, it was all about love. It was about love for my students, for their future, for this planet. And it was very hard to have somebody tell me that that was not my motivation. But a couple things that I realized as I listened to somebody, presenting their argument against what I had done, was that our educational system very often upholds these boxes, these silos of subject area, and one of the things I was charged with was trying to make connections between boxes. And it was like, here's the course that she was teaching, and here is this issue, and they reside outside of one another, and so that was not her right. She did that because she has this personal bias. And I recognized in myself that I have always seen things from a systems point of view. I have always seen those connections. And I think there were some assumptions in my brain or my psyche that this is the way the world is. This is reality. I mean, I teach ecology. We cross over all of those things, and it's great, and it's one of the reasons I love it. And so I realized in that moment that one of the things that we need to do is to teach kids to see connections. And I think that the education doesn't always work because of the way that we are educated. So that would be my first my first comment about how education can play a role in crossing those divides. We need to make connections between the boxes. They exist. It's the way the world works. And when we compartmentalize things, we deny that reality, and we need to change that. Another thing that became really apparent to me is that I was very naive about the labels and the polarization, and I was asked how many conservative movies have you shown this year? And I was like, what? Is there a conservative rating system? I didn't think that way. And so I think it is, I don't want to say know thy enemy, because that sounds polarized too, but it really has taken me on this path of trying to understand where those beliefs and values come from. And I think in doing that, I have developed a whole nother level of compassion for people. And I'm not really able to teach compassion. I can only model it. And I always thought I was, but I think now that I'm much more mindful about it, that's important. And that doesn't mean that I'm perfect. I still struggle. But to have that in my heart as I'm going about what I have to do, which, teaching science, photosynthesis is real. Sorry, that's an inside joke if you weren't here last night. I mean, I have to teach about things, laws of thermodynamics. It's a finite planet. I can't deny that. And if we're acting in a way that, is exceeding our carrying capacity, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, I try to go about that in the most respectful and considerate way that I can. However, it's my job to teach that information. And so I guess, I just try to be, I just try to teach what I know the science is telling us, and then in the best way that I can, try to offer the positive things that we heard about. And Dr. Patz stole my slide because I was going to put up the what if it was a hoax and we changed the world in all these great ways for nothing. Because there are these opportunities, and I really, we don't want to scare kids. We don't want them to feel like they're powerless, yet there's an urgency there, and there's an opportunity. There's the opportunity to remake the world, to reimagine the world into something that is, in my mind, so incredibly positive. So my strategy now is to try to appeal to a little bit of everybody. I still am labeled an environmentalist no matter what. I could walk in a room, I guess it's how I look, I don't know. But, I don't feel shame in that label. But I do know that in my school's parking lot, there are people who have, cars with the vehicle banner that says hippie hater. And if that attitude is out there, if I'm hated for what I represent, well, that's a difficult thing. So I just really try to approach it with compassion, I guess. That's the bottom line. And that it is about love. I can't tell my students, I joke about, it's because I love you. I joke about that with them, but it really is. I want them to have a productive and awesome future. I want them to be able to enjoy the kinds of experiences that I am now, that we all have, and I want their children to be able to enjoy that. And so sometimes it means we have to talk about, well, what do you think it's going to be like for your kids? And that might not fall under the guise of teaching biology, but I can sneak it in a little bit. And so far I haven't been called before the school board again.
Thank you, Kathleen. Zach.
Well, that was awesome. I'm just really grateful to be here. This is the last semester of my senior year of college, and so this is like a giant therapy session for me. I study climate change and environmental studies, and I read about Kathleen senior year of high school when I was in Bozeman teaching this. I led an assembly program in elementary schools where we were teaching the story of stuff to elementary school students and using that as kind of a framework to have all these sustainability conversations. And then I read about you in the New York Times or whatever it was, and it made me think a whole lot about what I was doing and all these things that we're talking about. I met with Jan and Melt a couple of years ago, and we wrote letters to our representatives. I was in University of Montana Climate Action now, and 3 of my professors in environmental studies are here, and it really makes me think that, yeah, there isn't this aha moment like Bill pointed out, but that it's this really interesting journey that we're all on kind of together and process, and that 10 years from now we'll look back at where we're at in this conversation now and have a lot of different perspectives on all this. And it's really a challenging one, an exciting one, and a intellectually demanding one, I would say. So I'm going to try and do my senior thesis here in 5 to 7 minutes. I'll start with my freshman year of college. I was a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed climate change enthusiast, and probably aptly labeled an activist. And I think a lot of my personal journey in the last 4 years has been either becoming less of an activist and something else, or a different kind of activist. I don't know how to label that, and I'm kind of terrified of labels, as Kathleen pointed out. But I went to my advisor, Dan Spencer, and that 2007 to 2009 period of time was so interesting for this conversation. There was all this momentum towards national legislation, and the conversation was going so well and was so exciting, and people my age who were interested in this issue felt this level of inertia that we were all working towards something, and the momentum was building in the right direction, and I was kind of involved in swimming and all that, and then the Environmental Studies Department announced that they were going to send 2 environmental studies students to Copenhagen for the United Nations conference, and this is where we were going to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, and this was going to be the big global solution to climate change. And I thought, oh my goodness, I need to be there. This is like this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We could solve this issue, so I've worked with my professors, and I went there, again, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, with probably about 20 or 30,000 of my peers who were about the same age, and we all went there thinking this is going to be the solution, and we're all going to be part of this, and we're going to speak to the United Nations delegation and tell them why this is a generational issue. And there was this energy that was unbelievable. And it was the second largest gathering of world leaders ever. There were 130 presidents and prime ministers and everything else all coming to talk about climate change. It was so exciting. And then 2 weeks and nothing happened. And it was pretty devastating on a lot of levels, confusing, and a huge, crazy jumping off point into my studies of climate change and this whole conversation that we're all having now. And I think it's left the environmental community really trying to grasp and figure out what's next in a lot of ways. And that frames the way I've experienced college in a million different ways. I'd just say that the broad stroke of how that affected me as a student was it made me think, well, if that global cooperation stuff seems pretty much impossible if we couldn't do it then. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done at home first, and that's more tangible anyway. The United States economy and China's economy isn't tangible to me. Maybe it is to somebody, but I can't wrap my mind around it. But what I realized and have realized is I can wrap my mind around the University of Montana and our 15,000 students and our climate action plan, and that to me is a little more tangible. And so that's where my personal trajectory has gone, that I guess I'll do what I can on this smaller scale. It was something I can wrap my hands around. So I've engaged a lot with the Climate Action Plan and had hours and hours of discussion with Nikki Fear and my peers and my professors, and we worked on the biomass plant. That was part of it. I'm sure there's some in the room that were opposed to that project, but either way, that was a part of that process, and it failed. And so about a year ago, I thought, well, where does this leave us? And President Engstrom came to one of our student government meetings and said, well, we're putting the biomass process on the shelf, but we need new ideas, projects to move forward on our climate action plan. And since then, I, for whatever reason, latched onto energy efficiency, and that's what I've been working on over the last year and a half. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. And then I'll just briefly mention one of the shared experiences that many of my peers and I have had, and Nikki, and probably a number of you in the room too, is this really interesting social experiment when we had this Power Shift conference last year. We didn't really realize the nerve we were going to strike with all that. I was part of organizing it, and it is something that now I'm the student body president at the University of Montana. We're talking about it with legislators during the session now. It was a gathering of a couple hundred students. We talked about all kinds of issues related to climate change, but there was a newspaper article about this coal protest, and the Republican Party latched on to that, and they haven't let go of it for a year now, and we've been talking about it to everyone. And it's presented a really interesting challenge, I think, for a lot of us to really figure out how to get beyond that. And one of my examples is I was now I'm the environmental studies climate change student body president. So when President Engstrom has to go and meet with a group of Billings legislators who are or Eastern Montana legislators that are just up in arms about this and furious, red in the face, furious, that President Engstrom would support some conference that would question coal's economic stronghold in this state. He asked me to go with him, so I went to Billings with him, and I meet with all these people, and we go around and introduce ourselves, and a Republican legislator asked me what I'm studying, and I say, climate change studies and environmental studies, and they're like, uh-oh. So that was a great experience for me, really learning how to embrace that label of what I'm studying as best I could. I'm still struggling with that. It's all a process, right? And we visited a coal mine. That was part of it. I have to say that whatever you think of the guy, I am really terribly proud of how President Engstrom has handled that controversy. He is in an incredibly complex position with all of that. Even, I would say, I was thinking like Mayor Engen has sort of taken the charge on the city's climate action plan, but you're a Missoulian, so the Eastern Montanans have already written you off anyway, so no worries there. But President Engstrom is in a more challenging position because he has alumni and people in the oil fields and financial supporters, and he has to work with legislators every day during the session and for higher ed funding. He is in an incredibly challenging position with that kind of an issue. And then he has to deal with me, who I'm sitting there as his constituent or his student body president saying, climate action plan, what are we doing on this? Let's keep moving. And so he's got to balance me and a Tea Party or coal miner Eastern Montana person, and that's really a challenging position. But he's taken a very humble approach to it and done the very best he can in a complex situation. But we went and visited a coal mine, and I sat on a shovel with a lot of coal miners who all knew that I was this hippie environmental studies student, and this machine was a $30 million machine that's larger than my house that removes the overburden earth material. I mean, the shovel scoops up 3 tons of material at a time in one big scoop. I mean, it was just a mind-blowing experience. And I would just say that kind of going back, I guess I'll try and wrap up here so I don't, like I say, 4 years and 7 minutes is hard. What I feel like I've taken away at some level from all of this is that those folks that is that compassion piece, that those people that you may read about in the newspaper and just think, whew, that's really unfortunate, or that's scary, or those people are crazy, or whatever. Those people, a lot of them are really wonderful people. Some of them are scary. Just throw that out there. But some of them are just the most lovely, gosh dang people in the whole world. And there is always room to find common ground with those people. And that this process, I'm not going to go and testify on a climate change resolution to the 2013 legislature and change a whole bunch of people's minds about climate change. I mean, that's, unfortunately, that's a role that I'm not going to be able to play, but there's space in folks in that legislators' minds and hearts to find commonalities with some student from Missoula and work on things together and build trust and relationships. We wrote a bill about energy efficiency. Two of our largest allies became Tea Party or Republicans. And I just yesterday, in fact, was in Helena, and I gave flowers to Nancy Balance, who's a Tea Party Republican representative from Hamilton. I probably don't agree with her politics 9 times out of 10. She is the loveliest, most thoughtful woman in the whole world. She has a different point of view and a set of ideologies, but when our bill came up that students wrote about energy efficiency, I called her and the day before it was going to be voted on the House floor, and she said, I don't think I like it very much. This is why. She had some really legitimate issues with it. But she said, let's talk about it. Tell me, and we spent 2 hours on the phone. For how busy those people are, my jaw was on the floor with how much thought and time she gave to it. And she ended up voting for it twice. And I thought, well, this woman would never vote for a climate change resolution, and she would never vote towards anything that would undermine coal or anything like that. But she is one thoughtful, lovely woman, and there are a million people just like her that aren't on our thought plane or don't have our same ideology, but and finding that compassion with her was a really powerful experience. And so I just would wrap up by saying I had this really interesting conversation yesterday with Brian Kahn, who is a radio guy. You might know him, I might say Common Ground with Brian Kahn. And he's just like he sounds on the radio in real life. But I've learned that his thoughts on Common Ground and the name of that show, that couldn't be any more sincere. That isn't a gimmicky name that was catchy. That is like his life philosophy, is finding common ground. And he was talking about environmental conservation issues, and he compared them to women's suffrage. And he said women's suffrage leaders didn't gain immediate traction with housewives in the mid-1800s by telling them that they were living their lives wrong and that they were just wrong, or needed to change their ways immediately, but that over the course of decades and a century and whatever else, they gained constant traction because there was always space for commonality, and there's always space to kind of move people along incrementally, and that conversation has evolved to the point where women's suffrage has all these incredible successes and milestones. And that process is still going on. I just read today women make 75% of the salaries that men make in Montana, so that we haven't won anything necessarily in that regard. We're still working on it all the time, but it's this process. And so it seems to me the trick would be, and I'm not good at this yet, but we'll try, would be finding the long view and not getting caught on that emotional roller coaster of the day-to-day wins and losses, but just kind of being able to constantly plug forward and find commonalities and compassion for all the people around you. And that's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. Beth.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for being on this panel, for one. And I know I invited you, but I'm thrilled to hear your personal stories and to just talk about this a little bit, because I'm interested in this topic of crossing the divide. Obviously, that's partly why it's of this conference, but since we decided to do that, I've become more interested, thinking about it more and wondering. And I'm really heartened with all the conversation that we've had so far today, and as we really think about how do we meet each other where we are. Because after my work in this field, which really has been for 30 years, and I'll tell you about that a little bit, I come to think that we have got to, as has been said today, find common ground moving forward together, because we are a multifaceted society that we're not going to agree. We don't need to agree. We all have different points of view, different perspective. That's the beauty of the pluralism. It's the beauty of nature, in fact, because nature itself has all these iterations and variations, and that's a wonderful thing about humans as well. So I don't expect to ever be of the same cloth exactly. And yet, we have these values and these needs that we need to address together. And so far, we have not been too good at that. I find it just very fascinating, these past maybe decade or decade and a half, of the splintering and the polarization and the vitriol in our society. Now, that's not the only option, and I'm so heartened by ways out. We're finding ways out, ways through that, and some of it's been discussed today with our speakers and with some of the movements that we've talked about. So a bit about my own way of crossing divides and experiences with that. As you know, I work here at St. Pat's. I'm a nurse. I've been working on environmental sustainability here for quite a while. My first recycling project was 1993. My first degree before nursing was botany. I really came from a perspective of the natural world and applied that to human systems all the time, and was frustrated that human systems didn't always reply back to me. And really, when I entered the field of nursing, which was in 1985, I felt at a moral crossroads for the way that our resource use impacted the planet. Climate change was really not a discussion point at that point. It was known in the science. It was known before that, but it was not public knowledge. I remember when I first learned of climate change, it was in 1990. I remember the conversation. It was life-changing. It was like, what? And so anyway, as my worlds came together, there was always a push against each other, because I also feel very committed to what nursing is and what healthcare can provide. We are here to serve, and we are here to serve everyone. We are here to serve people who believe any of the spectrum, and that's part of our professional duty, and it's part of our human duty. It's part of being compassionate. And also, I felt that healthcare itself was part of the problem in terms of creating good health. And that's not just environmentally, that also had to do with other things that I had problems with in healthcare. But the thing that ached me the most was really the environmental impacts of healthcare. So that's been my own background and trajectory. And I find it interesting to wonder how people sort of have that itch or don't have that itch. And my itch in that regard, I will just tell you, my first activism was when I was about 11, and it was in the 6th grade when we had a fair in our town to raise money to plant more trees. And so we had a little fair that we forced our parents to dunk for apples and stuff like that, and we raised $28 and gave it to the city. We were called the APs, that's the anti-pollutionists. So this has been a long-standing habit in me, really, and I'm very grateful at this point. You know the saying of I forget how it goes, but the resolution is where the need of the world meets one's personal passion. And so I feel so grateful to really be working in an area that's deeply satisfying for me. And that hasn't always been the case. I've wandered through various aspects of nursing with its frustrations and its incredible satisfactions, and I'm grateful for that opportunity now. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of divide crossing to be done, because hospitals are not environmental groups, you know, and hospitals don't think along these lines for the most part. I'm really grateful for St. Pat's and really for the Providence system, and some of you who have heard me speak before know that in our core value of stewardship, we have a sub-line that says we strive to care wisely for our people, our resources, and our earth. So to have that phrase embedded in our core values is very strong. I point to it all the time. I tell our own staff about it. And that really helps to guide the culture a little bit here at St. Pat's in terms of that aspect. That doesn't mean that's the prevailing thing that we think about all the time, but it's one of those roots that allows us to think culturally together. So that allows some of the divides to shrink, because we have a starting point that helps. You might imagine that putting on a conference like this requires some divide crossing, and it does. in fact. This is our third one. We had to, I think, gain confidence of our leaders over these past few years. And I would say in the fall, when we were thinking about the topic, we would not have been comfortable talking about climate change before now. I think we were now in the fall for a couple of reasons. One, we had experience and confidence more in the institution here. And secondly, there was, even before the election, a palpable shift starting to happen in society. I think since the election and since Hurricane Sandy and since Obama's inauguration talk, not inauguration, but State of the Union. Thank you. That even more so, it's a little bit more comfortable, but that for us, one way I think about that is not so much crossing divides, but walking on knife edges a little bit. So it's always about balance and figuring out where threats are to an extent, and then figuring out where support is on both sides all the time. It's like being multi-footed as we walk through. I know that we only have a couple of minutes. I just want to say two things that I'm more actively crossing divides about in terms of healthcare and environment. One is really connecting these dots. So it's a conference just like this. This is, my idea of what we need to do. We need to do more, of course, but we have to start connecting the dots in public ways that we can then talk about more easily. So as Dr. Pat says, this whole $49 versus $30 issue, that's the kind of easily graspable knowledge that we need and can move out with. Similarly, continue to link energy use to the diseases that we're talking about. So that's a big focus of mine and something that I think really helps cross divides, because as others have said, we're all interested in health. We're all interested in happiness. We're all interested in prosperity. The other area that I'm working a lot in now is my doctoral work, and I felt called, actually, I will use that phrase. I was at a conference, and I was noticing the lack of research, basically, in practice issues, so medical practice, nursing practice, other practice, and their own resource impacts. And so I was saying at this conference, yeah, somebody really needs to research that. We really need to do that in nursing. And it hit me literally like the next hour, that's what's happening next, isn't it? And so, in fact, it did, and I started my own doctoral work in that I am working on nursing practice, environmental impacts of nursing practice. And I also have had the opportunity at Washington State to really work on the curriculum a bit. And I look at Dr. Eide there, who has been part of that project. That, too, is got lots of opportunity for crossing divides, because people in traditional academia and in nursing don't necessarily connect those dots themselves. So many opportunities to talk, to educate, to support, to find support. And I'm grateful for all of those opportunities, and also the heartening response that I have gotten really on so many fronts. So I sort of end up thinking that these sorts of things, being able to work across cultures and across languages and across labels, across generations and almost across eras. We're at this point in our evolutionary history, I think, that's what we're called to do. We're called to help get through this impasse where we leave this prior world of fossil fuel dependency, and where we really appreciate more about our own impacts on the biodiversity of the planet, et cetera, since we're so dependent on it. I feel like that's our time. That's all of this. This will sound presumptive or like I'm putting something on you, but I feel like all of us alive right now, that's our job. I'm grateful to be able to work in that myself, so thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. I don't know what kind of time we have.
Not a whole lot, but we could take a few minutes.
We could take some questions? Fantastic. Are there any questions?
Yes, John, what's your point of view on that?
What's my point of view on this? I'm generally in favor or opposed, depending on my mood, Rebecca. Well, the crossing the divide issue is fascinating. It's a piece that I practice almost every day on a wide variety of issues. The climate piece in particular at the city of Missoula has been interesting. I started my limited participation in trying to move this subject forward in the city with a conference in 2006 in Anchorage, which It was then Mayor Mark Begich, who is now a United States Senator from Alaska. We were in Anchorage. We saw climate change made manifest on the ground in a place that reminded me of Montana on steroids. Begich, clearly in an oil state, had some particular political pressures around this topic and started to get kind of brave around it, and ultimately decided, if Alaska ain't Alaska anymore, we don't have much left. So he had to turn a corner. I didn't have to turn that sharp a corner. I am blessed with a constituency that is largely gets it. So we went from signing on to the mayor's climate change agreement to marching down a path to doing an emissions inventory, and then late last year, the city council passed a climate action plan. So we're doing, I think, pretty good work around those issues, sort of concentrated in the institution that is the city. I think we have more work to do outside of all of that. So, yeah. Any other questions? I can tell you what I've learned here quickly as I go down the line. Beth, I'd like you to put on another fair and give money to the city. Appreciate that. Zach, my job is a lot easier than President Engstrom's. I get that. I'm just teasing. I love Zach. He's a fantastic human being. Kathleen, I believe in science too, largely with a concentration in gravity. Learning more every passing day, I'm afraid. Jan, gastro diplomacy. There will now be a buffet at city council meetings. And Bill, it's all about marketing. But if we do we have a little time for questions?
Just like 2 questions if there are 2, and if not, that's okay.
Well, I actually am interested in the entire panel thinking about the notion of a campaign, which I found pretty compelling, that this isn't a friendly conversation between individuals, and it actually is we have to think about this strategically as a campaign. I'm wondering what the rest of you all think about that, because I thought that was a compelling. If anyone has anything?
Well, I would just say, just from messaging in the hospital and in the city for these sorts of things, I think it's incredibly important, and I think we need to apply the science of what we know about social action that Nikki was reporting about, and about psychology, and the way we frame our own messages and invite people to join us. So I think it's hugely important, and if I wouldn't know how to build the coalition to fund such a thing, but yes, we do need to do that for our own health's sake and the future.
Zach? I might chime in and just say that I really believe that with the fact that is true, it is a long process, it's a campaign, you can't solve everything over coffee, and that'll never be the way it works. That being said, I think the trick with, in my opinion, and I'm just a punk kid, so take it with a grain of salt, but is that environmentalists tend to, and activists of any sort, tend to embrace simplicity rather than embrace complexity. And what I mean by that is that it's a long, challenging, complicated process, and that from my perspective as a student who wants President Engstrom to be a gung-ho leader on climate change, that to be really thoughtful about how we move forward and support him, from my view, it's more effective to realize and think about and embrace how complex his situation is as a leader, and that he has limitations and a lot of constituents that are very diverse to meet and address and communicate with, and that it's more effective for me to embrace that instead of just totally focusing on the fact that climate change is urgent and you need to act now or you're failing, because I don't believe that that's fully true either, but that the long-term process and the movement or campaign or whatever it is will be more successful in the long run the more tactful, thoughtful, compassionate, respectful it is. That's just my opinion. I've seen a lot of activism that can have negative outcomes. For example, people that I've worked with dancing on Governor Schweitzer's desk, talking about climate change and having a drum circle in his office. And while they've certainly made a point, and it raised a lot of awareness, it made Governor Schweitzer very angry, and that could move things in the wrong direction, depending on your perspective. That's just my opinion. So tact and compassion and thoughtfulness go a long ways in the long term, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. Anyone else?
I'll say something quickly.
Yeah.
I think that health in a warming world is the easiest foot in the door subject we can bring up, because health applies to everyone, and I think that this is a good start, what we have here.
Bill?
I think it is a campaign because we need to get to an end result. It's we can talk about this forever, and we can all speak, a little like what Zach was saying. We can all go to our own separate corners and make ourselves feel very smart and talk about, how stupid the other guys are. But if we don't produce results, we've done nothing but bang our head against the wall. One of the comments earlier was a quote from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a star. And I think, unfortunately, in today's world, those of you who are here, it's the one about, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. In today's world, most people think they're entitled to their own facts. You can get facts from Steve Running, or you can get them from Sean Hannity. We need to be very careful as we move forward in this campaign that is, like I said, needs an end result, that while being respectful, people aren't afraid of the word environment. They're not embarrassed to be called liberal. I mean, this has been, vilified to such a state that people that are pushing for good change are a little nervous about doing it. And I think we ought to all take heart. And this is a moral fight of our times, I do believe, because I think it impacts so many things. And Jan's point's right. Health is, you have all the money in the world, and if you can't breathe, your life sucks. So I think it is something we got to take pride in, and we got to not be afraid to speak up. But we do have to do it with an eye toward the end result, not toward being able to walk out of the room saying, boy, I told that, didn't I look smart, and didn't I tell that guy off, and whatever. It's the end result that counts. And I think most of us would swallow our pride and ego to get some good climate change legislation. So I think that's the thing we have to keep in mind during the campaign.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you all very much. I know you've got a campaign. Anything, Kathleen?
Well, I am going to say one quick thing. The next generation science standards do address climate change and do address systems, and our state did not outright agree to adopt them. My understanding is that was because we have to include Indian Ed for all, which is a wonderful thing too. So we do need to have the ability to modify them, which if we had agreed to be an early adopter, we wouldn't be able to change them. That they're just coming on the radar, and people who would like to say we shouldn't be teaching these things may not even really be aware of what's included in them. So when that comes up, when that comes before, OPI and that conversation is held, please speak up, because there are still teachers who are scared to tackle climate change. I don't shy away from that, but I certainly could if I were in the wrong community. So please do what you can to be an ally in that effort to get the education to reflect what we know.
Thank you very much. All right. Thank you all very much. Appreciate your time and effort. My pleasure.
So if we, hello. So if we have just a little more energy, we got a couple announcements, and Kathleen's going to lead us in one other short participatory anticipatory exercise, and then we'll take a break. Is that okay? We got a little more energy? So one thing, I want to come in and just say a little bit about the nonviolent communication class that's going to be in conjunction with this, that I'm going to be offering. There's a handout that was on the table earlier. If you got one of the early copies, it has the wrong time on it. It should be 6 to 8 on there if you have one of those. And that's going to be Monday at the University of Montana in the UC, room 330. And I just want to say a couple things about that, what that's about. How many people here have had some experience with the nonviolent communication model, also called compassionate communication? Great. So if you've had any experience or that you may have heard some things throughout the course of yesterday and today that resonate with that. One of the things Kevin said earlier is finding a way to have a values-based connection with people. The whole last panel talking about how we can connect with people on differing viewpoints, differing worldviews, differing belief systems. So one of the cores of this model of communication is starting to identify the values and the needs that drive us, that are active in our lives, that move us towards the strategies that we choose. We've talked about beliefs here, and often a belief in coal or a belief in environmental change, we use the word belief in a way that can be confusing. In the nonviolent communication model, one would call that a strategy. That's a strategy to give us, to help meet our values and our needs in some way. So one of the things that we can learn in this model is how to start to separate the strategies from the needs that are underneath them. So someone who says, Zach's example was great of the senators or the ranchers that were red in the face, angry, about talking about changing what's happening with coal in Montana. That anger is coming from something inside that person that's connected to a core value that they have. And it may be around something we might call sustainability or safety or family or effectiveness or freedom or choice. Those words make sense? Can you understand those words? Those are examples of what we might call basic human values, and I would even say they are non-human values. They're values akin to all kinds of life in different forms that it manifests. So one of the fundamentals of this model and really learning how to start to communicate this way is to start to practice thinking in that way. What are the values here? Can we express them? Can we empathize and connect with what other people's values are? So one way to check it out is I want you to just notice what's alive in you right now. What are you feeling as a result of that last conversation we just had? Maybe what's lingering in you from Jonathan's talk this morning or the conversation last night. So you don't have to answer right away, but just notice, what are you feeling right now? If you could give it a name in terms of a feeling or an emotion, what would it be? And it may be a mixture. There may be a whole bunch of different things there. Pause. Hopeful. Yeah. Confused, yes. Promise.
Exhilarated.
Yeah. Frustrated? Anybody frustrated? Yeah. So there may be a whole mixture of feelings. Well, a basic idea in starting to think, and this is the practice, one of the things Kevin said earlier is some of this learning how to shift from the driver to the elephant, from the head to the heart, is to cultivate a practice of asking, if I'm feeling confused right now, or if I'm feeling exhilarated, what are the values connected with that? So I'll just use one example for me. If I'm feeling kind of overwhelmed by all of this, and I check in, I might say, wow, if I think about it, maybe it's because I have a need for some ease or some sense of trust, or maybe a sense of hope. I have a need for hope. Or if I'm feeling confused, I may have a need for some understanding or some clarity. Does that make sense? So one of the core pieces is starting to ask that. When I see someone who's angry and red in the face, it's very easy for me to get defensive. Pull back from that anger. If I can be self-connected and centered, I can ask internally at first, wow, what is this person feeling? Wonder what they're needing right now. And I may be able to say it. You know, when I hear you say that, it sounds like you're really feeling angry and frustrated, and you have a need to be heard and a need for respect. That may be off base, it may be on base, but right away what happens there is it starts to move us together. We start to hear each other and say, I can identify with that. So part of this is what goes back to that slide that Jonathan had of the Dalai Lama sitting there saying, well, if you're doing this, you have no compassion for the rest of the world. I don't remember the exact quote. And that's this idea that in learning nonviolent communication is we are doing violence in a way every time we make that kind of separation that separates, where we do not honor the needs of other people, the needs of other groups of people, the needs of other countries, the needs of other species, depending on your worldview. So the compassionate model starts to shift towards asking that question, starts to shift towards empathy. Empathy is trying to connect. What are they feeling? What are they needing? And finding ways to do that. There are ways we can start to shift from judgment to actually expressing what we're perceiving in a way that's more connective. Rather than that is wrong, I could say, when I see this happening, when I see you behaving in this way, I feel concern and I feel anger because I have a need for respect. It's easier for someone to hear when I say that because I'm owning what I'm feeling there. I'm not judging them for it. Then the last piece I'll say about that is that we have an ability to start to connect in ways that make requests in ways that are connective for people. So instead of moving right away to say, you have to adopt this measure, it could be, hearing me say this, I wonder, how do you feel about it? How does that make you feel? What does that bring up for you? What's alive in you? The key is I want to know I value your needs as much as I value mine. And that's the walk that's challenging to walk. So I just wanted to give that plug. If you want to practice some of that, Monday night we're going to do this at the UC, and I welcome you all to come on board.
So transition, we sort of spiked the thing already. Several people have gotten up and said, oh, I'm from Transition, Missoula, and I wanted to say is thus and such. So what is this Transition, Missoula? It's not like we're building a new town exactly. Somebody asked me, well, where is this transition town? Is it outside of town? No, we are building a new town, but you're in it, and you are the ones who are building it. We've been talking about climate change, so I'm going to talk about economics, which doesn't make any sense, right? But climate change, and a lot of people here are sort of in the medical world, climate change is very much a symptom of a very kind of complex and deep, cancerous kind of thing, which is just our way of feeding ourselves off of the earth. Everything we do, and we know this, everything we do in everyday life, from the clothes we wear to the transportation to pretty much everything, somehow has some currently generally negative impact on our climate and our environment. So transition is asking the question, well, what are we going to do about it? What can we do about it? How do we transition from where we are now, making these negative impacts, into, I don't even want to say sustainable, because if we sustain the current trend, we're going to crash and burn anyway. How do we create a world that's regenerative? Because it's very possible. A biodynamic, sort of intensively farmed, sustainably farmed, small acreage is 40% more productive than industrial monoculture farm. 40%. And you know what? The trouble is it takes so much more labor. But then you say, well, where are all these people that are looking for jobs? All of these solutions are there. The amazing thing is that we have these solutions and that we can create them and that we can develop them. But the big thing is, how do we do it? So transition is really about getting people together to figure out solutions. So we get together and we talk a lot. And that's terrible. We talk and talk and talk, but things actually come out of it. One of the things that's going to launch pretty soon is we're putting together a time bank where you can bank your hours working for things that you might do anyway, things that you might want to do that you might not be able to get paid to do, but you can bank your hours doing something, childcare or helping a neighbor or whatever it is, and then you can draw hours from this time bank to get things done that you need done. And the really radical thing is that all the hours are equal. So an hour of lawyering is equal to an hour of childcare, which, if you think about it, maybe childcare should be paid better than lawyering. So this is one of the solutions that and the thing about this amazingly complex, multi-dimensional global problem is that it's going to need an amazingly complex, multi-dimensional global solution. But we can't do that, just magically. We can only do it with our own two hands and the people sitting around us and our community. So Transition Missoula is really about how do we take Missoula and, it's already amazing. How do we make it the next step greater? Everybody holds a piece of a puzzle. We are trying to figure out how to put those puzzle pieces together, but we don't have the box lid that shows the picture. So you all have to turn up with your piece of the puzzle, and then we say, okay, my bit fits your bit, and if we create a bit in between to bridge it, then we start to make this multi-dimensional puzzle. So that's pretty much it. If you haven't yet, there's a table out there in the hall with Transition Missoula propaganda and an email list where you can sign up. You all already are doing so much, I know. From whatever you're working in the university and with bicycles and all these things, but this isn't going to be something that is an extra thing. We're trying to bring those pieces and fit those puzzle pieces together to take the whole community to the next step. And this is something that's happening globally all over the world. And then if all these communities then link their puzzle pieces together, pretty soon we turn the whole thing and we turn that tide. So that's it. Thank you.
There's a few things I want to do today. So this is a session on leading conversations. And so one thing I want to do is just kind of start a conversation about conversations. And I have some cards to help us do that. So you were asking where they were from. This is from a project called Group Works. And for people, I assume you all might be interested in how you lead conversations, right? So I wanted to let you all know about these set of cards, which I found really valuable as a way to start a meeting and provide some language about how we can think about group processes and patterns. And so what I want each of you all to do is to look at the cards. All of them have a different word on there and a description, and they all reflect different kind of patterns and of like group work that bring life to groups and group function. So I want you to just take a little time to look at them and choose one that resonates with you in some way at this moment, in your personal life, your work with groups, and then we're going to use this as a way to introduce ourselves. So you can, you don't want this one anymore? It's great. So take some time to look at it, and as a way to introduce ourselves, what I want you to do is we'll go around in a circle and everyone will say, what is it that interests them about the session on leading conversations, and how does this card that you chose relate to that, and then read it for us. Whenever you're ready, we'll start with someone, we'll go around in a circle. And tell us your name, obviously, too.
I'm Claudia, and I chose emergence. And I just read it.
Yeah.
Welcome the spaces between rigid structure and unproductive chaos, numbing familiarity and paralyzing anxiety. To work with complexity as a generative cauldron, encourage flexibility, self-organization, and mutual discovery. Embracing what arises, the group gives birth to new insights and forms. This is what transition is all about.
Great. So that's why you chose it. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. So my name is Carol. And I have presence,
And why don't you first explain why you chose it before you read it, so we can get a little sense of why you chose it and your interest in leading conversations.
Well, the real reason I chose this is because I couldn't find anything else there that looked very interesting, to be perfectly honest. But it's a good one. It's a good one. So what presence does is it asks us to bring our full attention to this very moment. Offering total attention and deep listening, you are wholly open and connected with the here and now. From this grounded place, love and service flow. Speaks to me of mindfulness.
My name's Ray. I have listening. It says listen from genuine curiosity, welcoming the expression of thoughts, opinions, and especially feelings. When we listen with our whole selves to more than the words, people feel heard and their energy moves into new channels, naturally weaving connections. I chose listening because that's sort of what I've done in my life. I was once a government investigator for many, many years with the National Labor Relations Board, and that's what we had to do, is a lot of active listening to different parts of a dispute. I've raised some children, and that requires a lot of very active listening to find out what's really going on with them. And I've tried to do that to some degree in the environmental issues too. I have conservative, very conservative friends, and I don't debate them. I listen and I ask questions. So that's my approach.
My name is Zach. My card is value the margins. And I guess I chose it because for a couple different reasons. One, well, I guess partially you could just generally say as a white male, I fit right in the middle of normal status quo and don't have to, and so often my role tends to be kind of, in all these kinds of conversations, I'm not a real, I don't have to express myself in an activist kind of a way, but I need to learn, and I'm working on learning. For climate change is the example. I'm really valuing and understanding and not judging the people that need to have a different role, that might have a different entry point into the way they work on things or affect change and so forth. Also, working in a lot of bureaucracy in the last couple of years made me really value the people that are on the margins, who are kind of pushing the conversation forward, the people that aren't so invested in the status quo that they are willing to kind of bring others along with them and drive the conversation forward and think outside the box. And there's a couple lovely people in state government that are just everything that I think a bureaucrat should be, and don't bring any of those kind of negative connotations that we all have with that word. And so that's where I was coming from when I grabbed it. And the definition is, edges of ecosystems are fertile ground for adaptation. Similarly, in group dynamics, growth often comes from generative disturbances at the margins, perhaps from participants less invested in the status quo. Welcome and embrace people and ideas that may at first seem alien.
My name's Tyler, and I chose the dive-in card. And I chose this because, I don't know, it sounded kind of cool. And also because my teacher, Miss Linder, Caitlin, told us about this conference, and none of us really had any idea what it was. So I kind of just had to dive into it, come and check it out. Seems like it's a good thing. Dive in. The card says, sometimes when the way ahead is a little murky, choose to just begin and try things out, choosing to just begin and try things out is the best way to approach the challenge, task, or issue at hand. With a commitment to learning from whatever happens, dive in to discover the path ahead.
Hi, I'm Lindsay. I chose magic. I don't really know how to explain. I just chose magic because I like stories when people can create something out of nothing. If that makes sense. we had like a wrestler this year, and I was on the wrestling team. But last year he was in drugs and alcohol, and he was in jail last year. And now he's sober and he got 4th place at state. So he created something out of nothing. And I just like stories like that, I guess. I don't know, inspiring. And my card says, at certain moments, something beyond the group emerges, accompanied by the sense of awe, and resulting in an enormous feeling of astonished accomplishment. Conditions inviting magic include shared passion, urgency, openness, energy, and trust. Yet the quality is always mysterious and never guaranteed.
My name is John, and I have the viewpoint shift card, and in fact I really did choose it because I had another card originally, and then I noticed this one. And this just seemed to be what we've been talking about all day. So the card reads, step from your usual perspective into another in order to better understand someone, shift energy, reframe meanings, open up new ideas, or simply see a situation with new eyes.
So I picked a power shift because I've been reflecting on my own experience and what I've heard at this conference. And science and education and evidence can only get you so far, and you need to understand who are the decision makers, why some have power and others don't, and that there needs to be an examination of power of decision makers and how to learn that system so that when we take evidence forward, we also understand the system we are putting that evidence into, because I think we need to know that system just as much as we need to know the science evidence. So the card, which has a picture of the Dalai Lama on it, and I think that's Nelson Mandela, but I can't tell. Or is that Desmond Tutu? No, Desmond Tutu's shorter. Anyway, critical awareness and transparency around existing power differences can, if held well, allow the group to adapt authority structures to best reflect their values or serve their aims. Sharing power isn't always easy, but the rewards for groups who do so can be profound. Do you have a card?
Yes. My name is Max, and I would have picked Emergence, but someone else grabbed it because that's something I work with a lot. And so I picked Fractal and realized that they're two sides of the same coin. Fractal, of course, being things that have properties irrespective of scale. The same properties remain the same. You see these beautiful drawings of the swirls or a broccoli plant. You see the plant and you take one off, it looks the same. You take that apart, it looks the same. So fractals being self-similarity irrespective of scales. And I look at that as an individual in a sense of working in a group. My individual personality will project itself in a sameness with everyone in the group, if that's where we're going. On the other hand, emergence involves properties that shift with scale or with numbers, so that when an individual is an individual, but when there's two people, it's different. When there's three, it's different because you have a relationship, you have things coming together. So I thought they were very well related to the dynamics of an individual in a group and a group as creating emergent possibilities.
Great, thank you. A lot of wisdom in all those cards and how you present them from your own personal perspectives and your meanings. So thank you all for sharing. I chose the card Deliberate, and I've actually chosen this once before in a session like this. I have become really interested in the opportunities that we can create through group work together and emergence, in part through a conference I went to last November in Seattle that was on dialogue and deliberation. And I'll talk about it in a little bit, but it was a really interesting awareness I came to that there's these kind of an emerging process even of bringing people together in dialogue to see where we can have, I guess I like the magic term, right? Like where we can bring our power together through people on the margins and kind of shift how things are now. And in my talk, we need to have kind of a major transformation, and I do feel like there's a lot of power in how we can come together as groups and conversations to reimagine something different. So Deliberate is a process that kind of bringing people together in a real purposeful conversation. And it says here, describes here, take time to reflect on the issues at hand and make wise decisions. Done well, thinking things through together helps us understand a bigger picture so we can deal capably and creatively with changing realities. And I appreciate what Zach said earlier today about how we don't really know where we're going to be in 5 or 10 years from now, and I don't necessarily have a vision for where we should be heading, but I'm more and more thinking that it's more the process that we need to be working on, and that these deliberative processes that bring people together from diverse perspectives is going to be, it's going to lead us where we need to go. So in this session, what I want to do is spend some time talking about the growing movement that I've seen of the use of dialogue and deliberation to address complex challenges like climate change. And there's some really exciting examples around the country and abroad dealing with big societal issues like how we spend our money in government, how we deal with education in schools and crime, to climate change. And then some of the work that I've done to organize some of those deliberative conversations. And then I want to spend some time providing a little bit of strategies for leading conversations, and I have for everyone some handouts here that include kind of a diagram of a conversation. So how do you bring people in from the margins and how do you facilitate those? And some skills that we won't go through, but leave you with these, which might be useful because I'm sure we'll all be in leadership and continue to be in leadership in these things. So some extra tools may be helpful. And then I want to end, I have this polarity management exercise if we get to there. So, yeah.
It's going to have to be condensed.
Oh, no, it's all very quick. It's all very quick. And I want to, I don't know, I really would love at the end of the day to have this be, to have us share as well. And from your own perspectives too. So, put that here. I'll just share some of the things that, how many of you are part of, kind of aware of kind of the growing use of deliberation and kind of public deliberations to deal with issues? Has anyone been a part of any of these processes or aware of them?
Just through you.
Okay. Great. Well, when I went to this conference, I was amazed that there's a whole world of people out there that have been thinking about this for a long time. And so there's one really, I'll just share a few different examples, but one exciting example is what they're doing in New Hampshire. They have this whole program there called New Hampshire Listens, and it started in Portsmouth. And what they do is they run these processes that run parallel to city government, where they just bring in a range of people to address issues that emerge in towns, like what should we be teaching in schools? How do we deal with the budget? And they meet together and they address the issues, and they come up after a series of meetings with a report. And then the report gets written up and actually gets run in the newspaper and given to city council. And what they're finding is that as they do these more and more often, city government is more inclined to kind of take the recommendations from these collaborative groups, these deliberative processes, because they know that they've been considered as a whole. They're not just individual issue-oriented people that want their particular agenda met. They're people that have been thinking about the problems in the wholeness and the complexity of it. And they now have in Portland, in New Hampshire, 75 trained facilitators that will go around to towns and help with these processes, and they have them in a number of communities throughout the state, so they're really scaling up the process. And they've counted something like 11,000 hours of deliberation in New Hampshire. Another example is in California. They've been doing now the budgeting process in some of the cities. They are using these deliberative processes. So what they're doing, and this is a process called, have you heard about participatory budgeting? It started in Brazil, and it grew out of 8 municipalities in Brazil where you bring regular citizens together and you give them the puzzle of the budget. Like, here's how much money we have to work with. You as citizens work through how you're going to allocate these limited resources. So instead of just the typical process where someone's saying, I want funding for this, I want funding for this, let's duke it out. Look at, well, okay, if we fund this, we're going to have to give up this. So if we fund schools, maybe we have to give up on the, some policing, whatever it might be. And we're using this process now in California. There's a city, I forget the name of, I can't say it. And they started the first year with maybe like 100 people showed up for these participatory budget meetings, and now they've grown to like 400 people, and city council is now adopting kind of the budgetary recommendations of these deliberative groups. I was contacted with someone last summer who was working at the campus level wanting to organize these campus conversations for universities to deal with how we address climate change, and Zach was a part of one that I organized on campus where we brought together, there was about 80 undergraduate students, and we convened them for an evening of 3 hours, and we had an expert resource panel that said, okay, our goal at the university is to become carbon neutral by 2020. I'd like your help, as a group of students to think how we might get there. So the students were introduced to the big goal, different strategies for how they might get there, and then in groups, in small groups with moderators, the students talked over a couple of hours about what strategies they supported, which ones they wanted to move forward with, how could they as students individually and collectively work on this. And we had a moderator for each table and a note taker, and it was really interesting because there was a lot of emergence of ideas that came from those conversations. And what I found interesting is that students were less interested in kind of the, maybe the biomass plant or some technical solution to how we bring down emissions, but really what emerged from that was a recognition that, wow, there are all these strategies out here that are being considered by the university, and I didn't really actually know much about these, and there's so much power in education and engagement that what we'd like to see actually is a university to scale up how we do our education about climate change and sustainability. So now we're going to, our next campus conversation as April is actually going to be on that particular topic. So I am interested in, and the goals of kind of the whole dialogue and deliberation community are that these deliberations aren't purely just about kind of issue learning and consideration, but we actually are developing new process for decision making. And when we gave the report of that campus conversation on campus last semester to the president, Engstrom, he really liked this process. So instead of students kind of coming to his office and saying, I want you to not support coal, or I want, this. He had a bunch of students who had considered the issue in the whole. Like, okay, what are the challenges if we go with biomass, and what are the challenges if we go with wind, and what can we do in a real constructive way? Yeah.
So what gave that process legitimacy? So, for example, it's great that you have a group-wide process, and it's sort of automatically better, more voices, and hand that to the president and say, wow, that's from a lot of people, good. But what gives you the credibility or the weight to say, value this more than 5 different people yelling at you? Or, what sort of formal?
That's great, and actually Zach played a huge role in this because when we organized the campus conversation, it happened to be on the night when our president couldn't be there, and he wanted to be a part of it, and part of what gains legitimacy, well, I guess there's 2 things: having the support of leadership, that the president said, actually, I support this conversation, and I'm going to be interested in what the students have to share. And so to further kind of get buy-in from the president, we actually asked him to record in advance an introduction and welcome to the students, which we showed by video, that said, thank you for coming. These are important conversations. We're in a state that uses a lot of coal and natural resources, so please keep that in mind when you come up with your recommendations. And so I think the 2 things happened. There was a legitimate process in the students' mind for showing up. They really felt when the students came, and I'm kind of answering this in a number of different ways, sorry. But I did a lot of work to try to get a broad representation of students from across campus. So I went to the hardest to reach places first, like the business school, and invited the business students. I invited the communication studies students. And lastly, I invited the environmental studies and climate change students. And I had a couple of students contact me ahead of time. They were asking, what are we supposed to wear to this event? It sounds really important. because people felt like their voice mattered and that I was trying to get a diversity of perspectives to move forward on this particular issue. So I think in terms of legitimacy, the participants need to feel like their voice is important and that there's going to be a process where their recommendations are given to leadership and there's a dialogue between those two entities. And I think we did that by kind of telling the students that this was important for them and then bringing the president in to do the introduction. Is there more to it though?
No.
I mean, I know there's a lot more to it.
I might just chime in and say that, like, having them feel like someone in a position of leadership, I don't know how you do it every time, but making them own it somehow and feeling like they are invested in it personally, and to the point where they're actually have this identity attached to it and they're promoting it and they have this sense of ownership. And there's this one administrator who she ended up helping us work out this concept on this energy efficiency bill, and she it was her brainchild. We were just sort of pushing the conversation and continually asking, how do we do this, X, Y, and Z, and it got to the point where she had this idea, had this concept, and then we asked her to come with us and present it to the president and to the commissioner of higher ed and whoever else. And so now it's at the point where she has this almost professional identity attached to the idea. And if we were able to somehow achieve that with President Engstrom, where he sees part of his legacy as president is actually doing this work in a meaningful way and helping the university actually address these challenges and feels personally invested in that process, then when he has to make hard decisions in a few years, which he will, then he'll be more likely to do so because he's been included in that process.
This reminds me of, I've been involved with many different assessments, especially on the national climate assessment scene, and the mandate, the most important thing to do is to involve stakeholders early and often. And that turns out to be the hardest thing to do, and to maintain that. And you talk about this is a process. That's where a lot of more energy has to happen, because you make a report, you do assessment, whatever. It could be a group process, but you throw it on someone's desk, and if they had nothing to do with it, it ends up being a doorstop. So, I think it's very challenging.
Is the goal of this process to reach consensus? Is that
Well, what's interesting about the deliberative process is that that's not necessarily the goal. And there's kind of a little bit of a difference in the literature on what the goal is, but the idea is different than kind of social kind of coercion or kind of like persuasion. The idea is when if you open up this deliberative process, you're not hoping that it will lead down to a particular decision, but that the decision might emerge different than what you expected it might be, but that it's a decision that people can kind of live well enough with, so it's not necessarily a consensus, but kind of accept enough what is being kind of, and it doesn't always necessarily lead to a specific decision. They're not necessarily processes like, well, we need to decide on this topic and we're going to bring consensus. It's more of a process, really.
So how's it different from brainstorm? Are you going to get into that, or are you just...
Well, I think it's usually there's focused questions, and so I guess I'll get into a little bit the structure where there is some attempt to kind of come to some convergence on what are the key ideas or interests of the group that emerge from the conversation. Yeah.
Stakeholders. I'm just wondering whether, we had one reformed coal guy here, but everybody else was not, we're all stakeholders in the earth.
Yeah.
But no oil executive saying, we've got a self-sufficiency of energy here by drilling for oil and fracking and let the Canadian ship, blah, blah, blah. But so, is that part of the process, is to try to bring divergence into
There is, yeah, and what's challenging this is kind of a new field for how we deal with climate change in this way, and there probably are some limits to how much divergence you can have in a group. There's some folks in Australia that have really tried to use this method, and they found that the real skeptics that show up at some of these conversations become more hardened in their views. And so I think there is some limits to how much divergence the conversations can assume. But
maybe over time.
Maybe over time, exactly. Yeah. And I like your point about kind of involving early and often stakeholders, because I feel like, you know, the people that came to our campus conversation last fall, they're a bit more bought into this process of, you know, I don't know. I mean, of the kind of what emerged from the conversation because they were there and part of the conversation. The next one I'm organizing, I'm going to have a mix of faculty, facilities, and students, each at the table. And so I'm really interested to see what might come out of that. Do you have any other things to add about how do you make it legitimate? Questions or?
No, but I'll just reflect on something you said about, and what you said about you can diversify, but sometimes it doesn't work. And for the IPCC, we brought on some skeptics into our health chapter, and one or two tried to sabotage the chapter instead of lend their, yeah, so sometimes it doesn't work out like you think. And I know that Bill McKibben in his 350.org, you know, has been very trying to build consensus and working across sectors, but comes to the realization that, you know, for oil companies, their job is to drill for oil, extract it, sell it, and we burn it. And that's what the profit-making
and by the government.
For that too. So that maybe there's some point where, you know what, that's something that just can't happen anymore. They're, you know, and so he's talking about divestment. But, well, you know, that's something that's just not, it's not going to work out. And that there is actually a drawing line in the sand and saying, this is something we're going to have to try to get rid of rather than negotiate. So that's up for negotiation. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I have a brother who's CEO of a large corporation, and for him the bottom line is always the stockholders. So, you know, there you have it.
It has to be by law.
Yeah.
Virtually.
Exactly. So, I mean, try to do persuasion with somebody like that. It's like, no, I go that route, I won't have a job anymore.
My personal thought on that is that you can still, there's still room for movement, even with those limitations on it, that you can, there's always some space for commonality, and that you can, that I'm thinking of it totally from my limited perspective, so I apologize for that, but the energy efficiency example and the climate change conversation, is that really pushing the envelope of the conversation? No. We're talking about saving money, and so that's a really easy conversation that has a broad support. But there is so much work to be done in that space. You know, even though it is a popular subject, there's so much room to improve that I think you can even, within those limitations, you know, ultimately there will be some harder decisions that won't have that broad support that you'll have to kind of really, the university or whoever else have to put themselves out there, but there's always room to progress.
Well, stakeholder also brings up the issue of what is at stake here. Is it just what we're going to have for lunch? Is it sending 4 members of my platoon into a dangerous minefield? Is it the end of the earth as we know it? You know, what's at stake here? And are there stakeholders whose interest, and maybe compassionate communication is how we get those people talking and communicating. But this process depends on what you want to get out of it too. What's at stake, and what are the policy alternatives, and what do we expect is a reasonable thing that this group gets on a lot of issues. What are we doing with this particular?
Yeah, I mean, these are all things I think a lot about, because my interest is the use of deliberation right now, but I think a lot about what's the limits of it and when is it not appropriate, and looking at where we need to head with this climate issue. Like, I feel, I'm of two minds of it. I feel like, and my mentor Karen O'Brien talks about this issue, it's climate change presents what she calls an adaptive challenge. Like, it's purely not, it's not just a technical challenge that can be solved by policy or technology, because if it was, we probably would have solved it. It's an issue that is caused by all of us, and will need all of us to turn it around. And so that brings me back to like that we really do need these processes that engage different minds and allows for kind of an emergence of something new. We probably need both of them. but I don't want to be naive and just bringing people together and we're going to come up with the best solution. But I also see kind of the psychological pieces of this issue where people are going to probably begin to feel more and more kind of powerless about what to do about it. And if we develop kind of a system and structure of kind of deliberation as a way that people can engage, then I think that will help people with the changes in a kind of psychological, emotional way as they unfold for us. I'll say just a few more things about kind of the deliberative process and then kind of map a conversation, and that's all we'll have time for today. But what I liked hearing about in the conference is that people talk about kind of 3 orders of change that they hope to see through these deliberative processes. So the first being that it's an opportunity for the participants to engage in issue learning, right? Whatever the topic is of deliberation, they get to learn about it because they get a resource panel, they get a resource guide, they're talking with people, so it's educational. Part of the learning is not just in the topic, but how the skills for being engaged in the deliberation. How do you listen? How do you suspend judgment? How do you invite in other perspectives? Some of the skills that Patrick was talking about in nonviolent communication. These aren't things that we are really taught and we don't practice very often, so these deliberations can just help us with those deliberative skills. Second order goals for them is that there could be, hopefully there is some kind of action that emerges from it, some decision individually and collectively, some kind of change that kind of emerges from these processes. And we certainly noticed that at our campus conversation. And then third order would be for these deliberative processes, these public deliberations, to actually improve our infrastructure for how decisions are made. So as I showed in New Hampshire, a kind of a parallel process or an emergent process that, as we see typical kind of legislative decisions often break down in polarized views. There's not really an opportunity for people to give more than their 3-minute statement about support or opposition, and these processes allow for maybe a more holistic understanding of complex issues. So improving the structures we need to support these deliberative processes, I think, is interesting. I'm certainly trying at the university, but it's really cool to see people from all over the country working on that.
Mm-hmm. And this reminds me of this emergence.
Yeah.
One thing that's emerging is powerfully is cooperatives. Mm-hmm. All over the place. People are combining talents to take the place of infrastructure that's, the way it is now, the top down and the corporations, and now it's getting to be cooperatives of people, reproducing what the corporations are doing, but on a local level.
Yeah. Thanks. Anyone else? I'll show you
I just got a really quick thought on the bringing in different perspectives. It seems like that's a challenge because, again, you don't want to have this naive vision of this everybody coming to the same place. But my thought would be that the challenge of that would break down some barriers with people in terms of just a sense of humility, which helps everybody involved to kind of realize and embrace the complexity of the whole situation in our society and all these goofy things that are hard to grasp holistically, and that creates a more productive starting point for moving towards solutions when people aren't so rigidly kind of boxed in terms of where they're coming from. And so, but the trick would be then not pushing it so far where they're so overwhelmed by the complexity that they just feel that it's hopeless, that there's not an entry point.
Well, both of your comments are kind of reflected in some of this.
I think when you get people together and you try to de-identify who they are, like student, professor, Buddhist, Hindu, and you just sort of strip that away and say, come to the circle as a human being. Take everything else off, start there, and forget about all your other identities. A nice way to have a conversation.
I love that. I love last night when the Buddhist woman talked about the pause, right? I just love let go of the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, right? David White, poet, philosopher, talks about that, and I just so appreciate it. I mean, there's so many lessons in all of this, and I feel like this emergent process I'm talking about kind of challenges us in all those kind of individual spiritual ways, right? That provide like a lifetime of lessons for all of us. Here is I like this diagram of a conversation here. On the left-hand side, it's business. There's a new topic that is proposed, and what this shows is that if you have a really most conversations involve several ideas, kind of usually the familiar options kind of being presented, and then a facilitator might attempt to close that conversation too quickly before anything really interesting has emerged from that. And what this diagram is showing, like kind of what a conversation might look like to get to something that is greater than that point there. And what it points out is that in the divergent zone, then you open up to divergent ideas, things that aren't like the common things that people usually present. And at first, like people might feel a little bit of relief, like, oh, finally someone's saying something I was thinking or feeling, and finally there it is. And it can be like, kind of the conversation comes a bit alive. But then you get into this kind of groan zone where you realize, actually, I don't really understand what that person's talking about. Like, that's a new perspective, and actually, I just need to sit with that for a while. It's completely different than what I've ever considered, and I don't really know how to incorporate it into the conversation we're having or into some kind of productive strategy. And there can be a period of like, confusion, frustration, aggravation, anxiety. And it's interesting as facilitators to know, I mean, these conversations can happen not just in, one meeting in 45 minutes, but if you're part of like a collaborative process, you'll go through this kind of groan zone. And so as a facilitator, just kind of be okay with that, with like, okay, things don't really know what we're having a conversation about. People are upset, and it's part of the process. And over time, and this can emerge just from the group starting to better understand the different perspectives in one another, you can reach some kind of convergence, and of course the facilitator can really help this after a period of patience and tolerance and supporting what's going on. People can start to feel a bit more like, oh, I get what they're saying. Now I have a vision for something that actually can be inclusive of what they're saying and what I'm interested in. I see something that's larger than what you had been looking for in the beginning, and feeling of kind of hope and imagination can kind of come from this. And then ideally, we end there with some kind of convergence. Again, Michael Thomas talks about this concept of clumsy solutions, like solutions that can be incorporated, the divergence there. But it's a process that can be very ugly and messy in the middle.
Partly is skewed further along here.
I think so. Very good point.
And there's an hour about time. So is there sort of estimated how long?
Depends on who's there.
I think this is also true individually, this process.
Yeah, it's about growth and transformation. Yeah. So on the next page, this gets back to actually something Zach was talking about, like valuing the margins. There's a diagram here of, the middle part are ideas that people express in acceptable communication styles, things that they're articulate, they speak in the time period that, we kind of expect. They don't ramble on and on. The people on the margins express themselves in styles that kind of turn us off and maybe make us shut off. Maybe they're overly emotional. Maybe they are kind of shy and nervous. Maybe they just talk on and on and on. Maybe they talk too loudly. And so what this diagram is as a facilitator, someone leading conversations, that your thinking is like, how do you increase the margins here so that people who are speaking in ways that are maybe shutting people down, other people are more open to them. So individually, we can do this by trying not to be judgmental of people, right? Kind of looking at what is the value of what someone's presenting, but then also someone leading conversations or ways, and the whole rest of this packet, which we won't have time to go through, kind of talks about that, like how do you rephrase for the person, or how do you like invite people who maybe are more quiet into the conversation. And there's a whole lot of tips here, which I would encourage you to look through, because I do like half of them often, and I'm trying really hard to get better at not doing the things you're not supposed to do. But what I like about it is that at an individual level, like inviting in those divergent perspectives can then help us with, kind of this part here, maybe there's some ideas there that if we can incorporate them, they're not going to be, they'll be part of the solution rather than continuing to be kind of on the margins to our challenges.
Thank you for this resource.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I think that's helpful. The last thing I was going to do, which we don't have time for, and you were right.
I didn't want to be right.
Was this, and I'm just kind of learning about this whole strategy of polarity management. How many of you have been made aware, okay. So a polarity is something where they're independently opposites that exist at the same time, right? Like you can't have cold without hot. They just are there. You try to ignore one, you can't because they don't, they both exist in the world. Kind of our emotionally, there's like attraction and aversion. Leadership styles kind of like hard and soft. And what's interesting about things that exist in polarities is that you can't ever solve them. All you can do is manage for them. And so I see this with the climate change issue. So often the issue comes out in a polarity of kind of worldviews of like individualistic and then kind of egalitarian. And I presented this in my presentation. Like people see the world like, well, we got to, the world exists best when we empower the individual to succeed and let go of kind of like subsidies. And we need to encourage individual innovation and enterprise. And others feel like, well, we need to more equally distribute the goods that we have in the world across everyone. Everyone is equal, and so on and so forth. And there's a whole bunch of there's people who have worked in this whole idea of cultural theory and have kind of helped identify different kind of worldviews that line up often in these polarities. And what I wanted to do, which we don't have time for, but you can just kind of think about it, is where do you line up in certain polarities? And then what you do is like kind of imagine what would it be like if you position yourself in the other end of it. And what then, what's the benefit of that perspective? What does it add to the conversation? And what's your own shadow side of the perspective that you're in right now? Because we need to manage for both of those. They're not going to go away. Like in our world, we're going to have, there's the value of the individual, there's the value of the whole. We make these decisions all the time, like when to put ourselves forward, when to put others forward, right? So it's not specific to Republicans or Democrats, but it's an interesting way to think of issues that we have in terms of polarities, and to practice on an individual level, kind of looking at what the pole is and imagine what that offers.
So are you sort of also saying, take the opposition side, put yourself in the shoes of the 180-degree opposing side, and try to get yourself in that space? Is that?
Yeah. Exactly. And that's,
if you, like I tend to do that too much, and what it does is it empowers me.
It can come across as wishy-washy.
Yes, but it also leaves me, so I'm such a great listener, but in standing up for my position, it kind of disempowers.
Well, that's a polarity right there. It's kind of the leadership style of being inclusive and caring, compassionate, versus kind of the more rigid and kind of like hard leadership. So what would it feel like to you to take that other way of leading, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And what would be gained there, what's lost and what's gained in your way, right? So that's a polarity right in itself.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Well, anyone else?
Well done. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have other resources on polarity?
You know what? There's so much out there that if you Google polarity management, but I do have resources.
So we'll just open it up to sharing a little bit about what maybe you heard, something that stimulated you, questions you have.
I'd love to hear from the other groups I wasn't part of.
Yeah.
I think some of the most problems.
I think there's at least one enough more people we can make this on.
Oh, yeah, we can make one.
I really am glad that I went to Engen's group because it was wonderful and he had handouts. So, let's see. well, she had a, you know, like a synopsis of the meeting, and then these facilitating sustainable agreements, and real concrete information of how to get groups to come together and to communicate, and other kinds of resources too. So that was really good. I just feel this urgency, and I know I always have to let go. But I would really like to see something come of this conference, which would mean another meeting. But I just feel that urgency, and I have ideas too. So I hope we can.
Hey, Nikki, is that something that others could have access to?
Yeah, I could make it into a PDF and send it to you, and people can contact. Yeah.
Is it public enough we could put it on our Turning the Tide website?
Oh, yeah.
People can download it. You send me a
I'll
PDF, I could do that.
yeah.
And we'll also have the recipes, if I didn't mention that on the website.
And we'll put that poem up so people have asked.
Well, one thing in Nikki's group, we were in a process, well, it's distinct from the process we've been in since yesterday evening. We're pretty much preaching to the congregation here, and there hasn't been much divergence of views, and I think what Patrick's going to get into tomorrow at the nonviolent communication event is more in line with, boy, what happens when we get groups together and we're at each other's throats, or we, how do we work with groups that are opposing each other? And in this deliberative process, I guess you do work with that, but they're the outliers that they talk different, they have very bad ideas, they don't know how to conduct themselves. Anyway, I think we'll find a different type of learning tomorrow in that group. Very valuable. Monday. Oh, yeah, I keep thinking every day is tomorrow.
And certainly encourage people to bring, here's what somebody said to me that totally stumped me. How can I connect with that person? So we'll try and practice with those kind of statements.
Does someone want to synopsize Louisa's session? Someone besides Louisa?
Awesome. It was awesome.
Tell us about it.
Actually, everyone in the group, she had a talking crow. And those of you who live in Missoula proper know what a talking crow is. So she shared an experience of why she uses the crow, which was very kind of cool, and that the crow is a teacher. And then we opened, actually, the group with honoring all directions. So the north, east, west, and south. And up above and down below, so we brought them all into the room. And then we talked about an experience that we had with nature, went around, and also experientially kind of what was going on with us as well. And then then it went around, and we didn't have much time left, because everybody did share in depth their heart and soul about how they have been coming to this place, I guess, is really essentially. I don't want to share, because it sort of was a psychological event, so everybody's personal situation, because it was personalized. So, and then we closed with honoring the directions again, and actually one of the interesting things that many of us felt in the room was that because we were in a hospital where people die, that we actually were, I don't know how people are open spiritually around here, but sometimes people get stuck when they die really fast, and they don't necessarily get released. And I think that our group kind of felt like we were kind of helping some of those people that were a little bit stuck. So we felt that we were bringing light to a place that people could be liberated from. So that's my personal idea on everything.
This is a crow, a raven. And my cousin gave it to me on the night of my mother's wake, and it's been in my car now. It's a 13 7. I'm going off and another guy around the 4th of July. And she gave me this tonight. And it's been raining on my dash the whole time. And then all the feathers came off. And I pasted more on, and that's why it's so beat up. But the crow is the link between life and death, the ordinary world and the non-ordinary world. So it's the spirit world and the ordinary, and they're one and the same world. And the crow is a constant reminder because it's all cleaning up all the death. And of course we eat each other, right? You think that crow is the only one who goes out there and eats. You eat every day, and you eat everything around you. So the crow is a reminder of our mortality. This is that. If that's that special.
How about someone from Amy's group?
I'll give it a go. Oh, I thought you said.
That's okay, go from Kevin.
Okay, well, from Kevin's group, he talked about resilience, and he talked about the importance of being adaptable and flexible, and that this is a long-term situation that we're in with climate change and the kind of stressors that are brought on by climate change, all the psychological stressors, and that we need to do things that soothe, to be more effective. We need to possibly practice meditation and yoga and things that sort of calm our system down, so that we can bring it out to the world more. And resilience, flexibility, adaptability. We talked about forging connections with people. That's going to be important. Developing relationships with people. Factors that influence people's happiness. Some of those are the same. Important things to be cultivating. Some of those, and he says certain people have propensities toward being more adaptable. It's almost like we're just genetically wired to be more adaptable or not. So some things we can cultivate to allow growth in that area, and he's a wealth of information, as you know. He's run a lot of study after study, but there's just a lot of research out there that says that we need to join together and not be divisive about these kinds of situations that we're trying to solve. That's about less than half of what he said. But anybody else want to add to what he said?
Well, it sounds valuable. I saw Amy's group come back in. Would someone want to report out? Someone besides Amy?
Sorry, we got to talk about politics. We lost track of it. Good? No, you got it.
Well, Amy gave us a good rundown about, again, the mitigation and the difference between that and adaptation. Sometimes there's not much difference in overlap. And how to get to policy is kind of a slow process of building background and establishing political cover for the politicians that are going to be making some of these decisions. And that can be done through visits, letters to them, telephone calls to them, whatever. You just have to keep at it to build this background, so they can say that their constituents say that they want this or they want that. And a lot of it is, policy, as she tried to explain, was a little bit different than when a protest, say, against the Keystone Pipeline. That's kind of a different thing. The policy is a bigger thing of looking for the Clean Air Act, that type of legislation. And we talked quite a bit about going to Washington, D.C., how to approach our senators and also key committee people, which I think we have to be attuned to, and she can give us some help for who to contact. And right now we're looking for somebody that knows President Obama. Maybe someone does. When you think about it, we've got Messina, he's in there, he's a Missoula guy. So just because we don't know right now doesn't mean we can't find out. So it's kind of an ongoing thing, and really enjoyed the talk.
Can I just stop with one thing? One of the things I just wanted to tell everybody is that, you know, when they look at who's respected in polling about where the public respects, health professionals are at the very, very top. They're above scientists, they're above ranchers, they're above teachers. They're even above environmentalists, of all things. We're at the very bottom. So if you are a health professional or you know one, get them to speak out, because it is a very disarming commonality place of talking about our kids' health, our health, the numbers and the, you know, all the that we talked about earlier, economics sort of fit that frame. And then we also talked about sharing your personal stories and the importance of that in order to move policy forward. Just a couple points.
Wow, that sounds really valuable. And so if I synopsize it here, I can't do this nearly like Mary Ann can, but if you think about from Kevin's work of calming ourselves down so that we can be more effective and resilient and more connected, to Louise's work of honoring our place here and what has come behind us and to the ahead of us, to Nikki's work about how can we really start to have these conversations that are difficult in a small group and in a larger group, which leads then to how do we impact policy. Those are all great skills, and I hope that if others of you have things that you can share and want to share online, we can post that for the group, because I'm sure we'd all like to download to each other everything that everyone has learned.
Automatically into our
Yes,
brains.
exactly. And this leads us to, you know, our last few minutes together, and what we've done sometimes in the past is just had a moment in a circle. This is kind of a circle. We could stand up and hold hands if you want. We have done that, and last year, just so you know, we actually sang songs. And so we can discuss that if you'd like to. But at least it's an opportunity now to say what we'd like to do is, as some of you have said, and Claudia said so passionately just now, that this sense of urgency that we want to do, we want to take this, what the energy that we get from each other today and the learning that we get from each other, and be able to do something with it, because we all do feel urgent about this. So at least a hair toward this direction that we could do now is just talk out about, for a moment, about what it is that you will do. So to make commitments, they don't have to be big, they can be small. Something that you would be willing to commit to, and that you would be willing to say publicly. One time we did at St. Pat's, we asked all the employees to commit to 3 things they would do to decrease their environmental impacts. It was voluntary. We had at the time about 1,400 employees. We got about 1,100 who participated. They each gave 3 things, so it was over 3,000 commitments. So, and that was completely voluntary. So I think there's some value in saying it aloud. If anyone has something that they've been moved to do or add to their habits or build today, is there something you'd like to share with me?
I will. Yeah. I'm going to work on manifesting neighborhood emergency preparedness models to build, and the basic reason is not to learn how to be prepared in an emergency, but to build a community first.
Okay. Did y'all hear that? Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. Thank you from the community. Yeah.
I'm going to take one of our second car off insurance to pick up the lighting.
Taking the insurance off our second car. Of course, less combustion engine movement. Yeah. Yeah, Carol.
Well, 2 things. I'm already actively involved with Transition Missoula, but I have tried several times in my life to get going with a regular habit of meditation, so I will try once more and keep developing right in mind.
Great one.
And also, it occurred to me today that this is temporary. People who know me know that this is normal. after I get the test in April and recover, then I will have another try at the thing whether it's possible to do right by. It wasn't in the past, but it might be. I think it would be interesting.
Cool. Jen.
Well, Patty already mentioned it. I think the idea of having an event where we use the MCAT recording of Dr. Pat's, and if we have one on Dr. Lockwood, and then throw in some food for good feeling, and have it in a different venue, we might be able to attract different people, and I'd really like to see that happen. So I'll talk to our group and see if they will get behind it, and to any other group that's interested, because it doesn't have to be an onerous task. We should be able to put it together fairly simply.
I'm going to go to Pat's group, the Nonviolent Communication Workshop, and I'm going to read the book, Active Hope, and pray a lot.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm going to go to Active Hope, the group that you're having. I think the next one's 17th, but I don't know about this, so my first step is just to become more aware of
Can I extend that invitation to anyone that's interested in coming to the Active Hope meeting or the Heart and Soul meeting of transition group? It'll be next, not tomorrow, but the Sunday after, correct? Am I on my dates from 3 to 5, and at the University Congregational Church on the second floor of the fireside room.
And there's handouts.
Yeah. And just to kind of frame it as we're going to be doing a formal process of kind of looking at what we might want to do in the future. So it'll be a great time to kind of articulate that. And we're going to do a practice where we write it down and then speak it back to the person that just told us that. So it could be very powerful for you to have something and think about the gifts and the challenges and all of the things that connect with that. And I'm going to commit to trying for April 11th, if I can get it off the ground, to bring the film Occupy Love to Missoula. That is something, you may have seen the trailer for it. It looks like it's going to be a really fabulous film, and they encourage a discussion afterwards. So I'm going to try to find a venue, maybe the Roxy if it's available, I don't know, spring for it, and organize that, because that's its like worldwide global release date. So I'm going to try to do that. So April 11th, or maybe it'll have to be the 12th or whatever, depending on scheduling. But I hope that'll be an event that people will come to.
If anybody's on the internet, if you can't remember all the dates that she just said for our Heart and Soul meetings, or any other events that Transition is having, we have a website, transitionmissoula.org. We have a calendar of events. We also have a Facebook page, Transition Missoula, and we put up our events up there. We had, Turning the Tide, and we invite people. And so if you can't remember, and you didn't write it down, or you can't come to this next one, then just, pop in and take a look at our calendar, and you can keep up with our events that way. So part of my intention is to keep our calendar up to date. I know I can do that one. We always want to start out with the 10 that you can do, right? And we're also going to have a movie at the Co-op called Economics of Happiness. And Justin talked about economics, and the economics of happiness is something that is really something we should all be thinking about, especially after this group. How can we maintain our mental balance, right, in this whole fraught situation? We have another movie as well called Shift Change. It's going to be at the Co-op on Wednesday, right? Wednesday?
North Missoula Community Co-op.
Missoula Community Co-op on Burns. And we have handouts on the table there. And my other intention is going to be a hard one, because I've seen how hard it Beth to pull this thing off. There's a global movement to have plastic-free cities. And Australia started one called Plastic-Free July, where you just commit to 1 month, and even in that month, just one day, even just 1 hour, I mean, if you think about what you do, even going 1 hour without something plastic in your life, in our world, is so challenging. Now, my cousin lives in Austin, Texas, and she works sadly for the governor there, which is, he's a fighting man. But Austin itself went plastic free. You can't have day-use plastics in the stores or day-use paper bags. If Austin, Texas can do it, by gum, I think Missoula certainly can do it too, as well as other cities around the country have gone to do it. So hopefully if you start seeing things going out there that we're going to have a plastic-free July, you'll know that I've gotten over the hump of fear of organization. And maybe you'll come and help join us and solicit your favorite grocery store to join in for a day or a month or even an hour or maybe the whole month to go plastic-free. So that's my intention.
Mine's a little smaller than that. I have a gathering of women at my house on Thursday, about 10 of us who've been doing this for 30 years on a regular basis. And I'm going to bring the exercise that we did with us and ask people to talk about also what the difference are to living. Because I know that all of them, that there's different levels of belief. I know that all of them believe in climate change, but I don't think those who act as yet they can have an impact. And so what would that look like if you did?
Well, another thing that is a possibility, there's an Earth Hour, and I think it's in April, around Earth Day, but it's a global participation, 1 hour in your time zone, where you turn off everything and get together with others with a candle and do something meaningful. I've done it for 3 years, and it's just really wonderful. So I want to just have everyone take home the idea of Googling Earth Hour, finding out when it is going to be, and do it.
Thank you. Good reminder.
I'm going to, I don't eat very much meat, but I'm going to eat less, just thinking about, or I'm not going to eat meat, just thinking about them as other, sentient beings that want to live also. And because I already feel like, I do eat turkey, that's the one meat I eat, but whenever I'm eating other, anyways, I just feel like they are, it's like I feel like a cannibal almost when I'm eating other animals. But so no meat, and then also, let's see, I'm going to start a more regular loving kindness practice, because one of the things Kevin talked about was that it strengthens your vagus nerve, it strengthens your cells to practice loving kindness meditation, and it helps your immune system. It really helps the stress, the feeling of stress in your body as you practice loving kindness meditation. So less meat, which would definitely be a help on the planet if a lot of us ate less meat or don't eat fish. And then loving kindness meditation. And thank you, Beth. You are awesome.
So I'm going to follow up on my good fortune of meeting Senators Baucus and Al Franken last night. And I'll be in Washington at a meeting, and we'll try to meet with them and talk, at least Al Franken, to talk about the health benefits of clean energy. And we'll try to get that more into the congressional agenda.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to continue this conversation in the clinical setting. I think it's wonderful that some Pat put this on and that we really are integrating these topics. And I think that one of the things that excites me is being able to continue that integration. So I work at Cost Care, and there's a lot of different urgent care clinics around, and so there's a lot of providers that rotate through. And I'm really excited about continuing this conversation. I know a lot of them hold very different views, but I think that it could be a really valuable conversation to continue this, and both pulling in the tactfulness that Zach talked about, and also that passion that I think Louisa really represents, which is really excited about doing that in the clinical setting.
Earth Hour is 2 weeks from today, March 23rd at 8:30 to 9:30 p.m. Okay?
So, as a nurse, I want to be teaching more about the health benefits of clean air. That feels really good to me.
I'd throw in two really quick things. Help others, empower others to feel ownership over some of the projects that we've been working on, or the climate action plan, I think he talks a lot about in our university setting, and help other people who, as I'm graduating and leaving, other people feel ownership and empowered to take on some of those efforts too. And the second piece, which is more general but also feels very related to all these things, is continuing to focus on learning how to not judge myself and my own limitations, and judge others and their own limitations and those differences, and just continuing to kind of think about that and try to move on it.
My own commitment is to continue the things I'm doing and really be discerning about things that I add. I tend to do too much and go in too many directions, and I really, really value effectiveness. And so that's the challenge to myself always, is to be realistic about what I can personally do. And I have great opportunities to do things.
No more instruments?
Well, I won't say that.
I guess something for me is to continue to try and reach across the divide, talk to people that have different value systems. Part of that for me is a continuing redefining of conflict in my consciousness. Really seeing it as the gift instead of this. And I'm going to go dance and tango.
Actually, I'd like to applaud Jackson. He gave flowers to somebody who we perceive as, I don't want to say an enemy, but to somebody who doesn't agree. So that's crossing the divide. So if each of us could, maybe not even give physical flowers, but at least make an intention to go to someone that you know is totally diametrically opposed to what you believe. Because I know some people in here don't even have a friend that's in the GOP party, and they only talk to the choir. So it's a challenge if each one of us could leave this very wonderful conversation and actually go and intend to go talk to someone that you know does not agree with you, and see if you can hold that talking stick in your hand and not open your mouth, giving them a bouquet of flowers from your heart. Whether we get to go to Pastor State and learn on Monday or not, but you have all of Sunday to do it. You know, how cool would that be if each one of us just did that? What a healing thing that would be.
Can I say, I'm going to spend more time contacting the legislators.
Contacting legislators.
I don't think I should do that, but I think just take the time to do that.
Well, thank you all so much for spending your time with us both last night and today. I hope that you will consider going to Patrick's session on Monday night at 6 at the university. I'm going. I really look forward to it. I think it will be more tools that we can take forward in our work. And also, I want to just say again that Dr. Lockwood is coming. Georgia was going to be talking about the health effects of coal today. And it was a little bit of a tickler for his talk because hers was going to be shorter than his. But I hope, because we didn't get to hear it today, that everyone will be able to go. That is March 21st at 7 at the university. And both Amy and Kim have been working on that. Georgia and they are taking him around the state to 4 different cities to talk. He wrote a book called Coal, the Silent Epidemic. I think that will be really helpful for us in Montana, particularly to understand some of those health risks. So please keep that in mind. And I just want to honor you all and thank you all for your time. It's been very enriching for me.